Hi, I'm Mirko, and I'm the program leader of the BA in Contemporary Music Production here at the IB. Today we're going to present a masterclass on the topic of beat making with found samples. The masterclass is going to be led by Jeremy Friedman, our faculty member of the program. This is just one of the topics that will be covered during the 3 years of the course, and we hope you enjoy it.
Today we are going to be constructing a beat from found samples. What are found samples? Found samples are what I call sort of atypical samples. Maybe you would call them musique concrète. They're basically samples that aren't the normal 808 kicks or Moog laser hits or any of these other things. They're samples that you can find by doing field recordings using your iPhone. You could also get stuff off of YouTube. One place that I like to get samples is from freesound.org, which has a collection of Creative Commons samples of things like doors slamming and crowds shouting and coins spinning. And this is a great way to create your own sound and to create beats from a perspective that's a little bit more into a sound design kind of environment. So let's get right into it. Today we're going to be using Battery from Native Instruments. And the reason that I'm using this plugin is, one, it's very powerful and it's a lot of fun to use. Secondly, it's also very typical in terms of the controls that you'll find in any sampler. So whether you're using a hardware sampler or a software sampler, you'll find many of the same parameters and parameter features. The other part is I just wanted to demonstrate that this can be done in any DAW that you use, whether it's Pro Tools, Ableton Live, or Logic Pro. Today we're going to be doing the session in Logic Pro, but everything is actually going to be sequenced from my Octatrack. Now, don't worry about what kind of sequencer you actually do use. I just use this because I find it a lot of fun. And also, just quick side note, you don't have to know anything about the Octatrack. I'm not using any audio out of it. I'm just using it as a MIDI sequencer. Okay, so let's dive right in. From freesound.org, I've actually downloaded 8 different samples, which are a little bit kind of on the bizarre to mundane side, but I think that we can work together to make something really cool. So let's take a review of the samples we have here. So the first sample is a door slamming. Let's check it out. Beautiful. The next sample is a recording of coins being spun on a table. All right. The following sample is computer keyboard strokes. Let's see, we do a time. It's a little bit soft, but you can hear that. Next, we have hot water being poured into a jar or a cup. Here's a motorcycle revving up. Here's a crowd shouting, happily, hopefully. Here's a call to prayer from Indonesia. And here are some wind chimes. Now, the first thing I like to do is kind of start to begin to allocate the jobs of each of these samples. And so first, let me turn off this button here so it doesn't play on every mouse click. And let's head to the first sample, which was the door. And I imagine this basically more as like a kick drum sound. So let's play back what we have here. Definitely sounds more like a kick drum. Let's work backwards and see what I did. Well, first of all, let's take a look. I'm going to take off this filter. Take off the saturation. We'll come back to that. Okay. This has a volume envelope on, which I'll explain, but the beginning, as you can see that on the sample itself, I actually chose a different spot using this S. This is just the start of the sample, so it's now starting at a different place. And I also changed the tuning a little bit. I moved it up. You can change the tuning. Most samplers have this. So I'm just going to tune this up to about, it's 5 half steps above what the original sound was. I also included a volume envelope, and a volume envelope just talks about how long and how quickly the sample will play. So if I take it off, you get this kind of long, sustained, kind of messy, non-bass drum thing, and that's not what we want. So I made it shorter. So let's add some effects to give it more of a bass drum feel. One effect that we can use, actually, is a filter. This is a low-pass filter, which will not only cut out the majority of the highs. I've already set the cutoff frequency to 111 hertz, but you can also raise the resonance here, so it has a little bit of a sharpness to it that I liked. You know, we have to use our ears. Next thing, I wanted it to be a little bit more gritty, so I added, they have this combination of lo-fi, which is a bit reducer, and also a sample reducer. Which basically means that you're kind of playing with the quality of the sample itself. Those are a little bit subtle, but if we add some saturation, i.e. distortion, we start to get into the realm of where we want to be. I think we can make this sound a little bit more bass drummy, excuse me. And one of the ways that we can do this is by adding a pitch envelope. And what a pitch envelope basically does is, well, you hear it. So what this basically does, you can see on the interface here that every time the sample is played, the pitch of the sample goes down and up really fast. So we have this kind of very live, sort of more kick drum feel to it. Okay, I'm pretty happy with that so far. So why don't we move on to our snare drum? And I've allocated the coins. There's the coins that we heard rolling on the table, which can be an odd choice. I'm going to take off the effects that I have on here, and I'll show you why I think this would work. Well, one thing is I selected a so here's the sample, the whole sample. Sort of see here. I selected a very, very short part of the whole sample, as you can see. And I tuned it up, and we're going to play it with the volume envelope on. It's kind of not really what I want. So I actually decided to reverse the sample. So this means that every time it plays, now it'll go from the end to the beginning. And if I didn't have this volume envelope on, but I put the volume envelope on, and now it's shorter. Great. Now I'm going to clean up the bottom end and also add a little bit more bite by adding a filter. And let's combine this lo-fi and saturation to get this general distortion, which not only adds harmonics but gives it a little bit more punch. And we're going to continue to give it punch by adding what's called a transient designer. You can see it already feels louder. What does a transient designer do? A transient designer basically takes the transients, the peaks of audio, and you can tell it to highlight those or to take away the transients using this attack parameter over here. You can also tell it to sort of sustain or take away the sustain from a note using this parameter here. It's like a compressor, just a very sort of short, kind of a shortcut to a compressor, and of course has its own sound. All right, so we have our snare drum and our bass drum. Let's go to our keystrokes, which I originally thought was going to be kind of a hi-hat. And sometimes this happens with sound design, is that you think it's going to be something, and then it turns into something else. And what I really liked about it was it started to have, I'm going to take the volume envelope away from here, and let's just listen to it sort of naked. It's kind of cool, but let's try and get one sound. That works. Let's make it a little bit more present, adding a filter and some distortion. And I also noticed that when I did that, I started to get a little bit more of like a tom-tom sound, which I thought was really quite nice. And this is when I started to introduce things like modulation. And basically what modulation does is you can take something either like an envelope that we used before, or you can take something like a low frequency oscillator, which is a waveform that runs at a very, very low speed or low frequency that you can use as a control mechanism. Meaning that, for example, every time the wave goes up, you can use it to control the cutoff frequency of the filter, so that the cutoff frequency also goes up. So it doesn't make a sound, it just is used to control things. So here I've actually set a low frequency oscillator to give motion to the tom-tom sound. You can also hear that I've set another one to give motion to the cutoff frequency. So it has kind of have like blips and blobs. And then you can hear that there on its own. So let's add those back in, the kick drum and the snare drum. All right, now we have this hot water. Let's just listen to it. There I just kind of filtered it, because I didn't want this bottom out. And I added a little bit more sort of like bit reduction. Of course, the volume envelope helps to give it a more rhythmic feel. It stands too far in the front, but we're going to deal with that in the mix. Why don't we add the bass? Now the bass, what I used was I used a motorcycle, remember? And one thing that you can do with continuous sounds like a motorcycle, first here I took a very small portion of the sample, and you can now loop that to create a continuous either bass, or you can use this for synths, or when you start to design voices. And so if I take the volume envelope off, and I'm also going to take off the filter. So you can see without the volume envelope, I'm going to put the volume envelope on. Now it has a little bit more of like a definition to it. I'm going to put a low pass filter on here so we get it like a bass. And then add some saturation, general distortion to have it stand out a bit more. Okay, we're getting there. Let's do the crowd. Same techniques. Select here I actually didn't select a portion, I just created a very, very short volume envelope. Added distortion and filtering to put it in its place inside of the mix already, and a transient designer. The other thing you'll notice is that you can hear that the note of the pitch of the sample goes up, and that is something that I programmed from the sequencer here. Let's add the chimes. That sounds very different than the wind chimes I heard before. One reason is because I tuned the sample down by 28, that's over 2 octaves, so you can hear when I turn it up, put it back down, and it has like almost like a gongy effect to it. Again, a volume envelope. I did a band pass filter to really highlight this one section. It didn't really do much else to it. Now let's add the voice. Now what's happening here? Besides all the filtering and etc., you see that the start point of the sample is a very, very long sample. So instead of chopping up into little points, I basically added an LFO to the start point of the sample. So now every time the sample triggers, where it starts becomes randomly selected. And it's a way of kind of like generating, it's kind of a lazy man's way of generating a melody. But it can be very effective, and you can really surprise yourself with the results. Okay, so we have our beat constructed with our found samples. Let's do a quick mix, and let's play this. So one thing I like to do before anything else is when I start out a mix, I mix everything in mono. So I have this gain plugin that has folded the stereo image into mono. This helps me get things clear and in its place, and at least I know that you can hear everything. The next thing I generally tend to do is mix with all of the elements together because they're going to play together. So let's start with the kick drum. I can't really hear it. So one way to solve this problem is to put a compressor on it with a very long attack, with a longish attack and a quick release, which will highlight the transients. Once again, we're kind of making our own transient design here. You're going to hear that we already hear a lot more. But we can bring things out with an EQ, highlighting the meat here at 150 hertz, and a bunch of the top end of the sound itself. You can do a lot just with compressors and EQs. You don't have to use a lot of fancy plugins. And the compressor plugin, for example, is a stock plugin that comes with Logic Pro X. Why don't we do the same technique on the snare drum? So as you can see, it has a pretty long attack time and a short release time. But it already defines it much more in the mix. And we're also going to use a nice EQ here, basically taking out almost all the bottom and highlighting the attack portion here at around 2000 hertz. Now you notice that I actually have a couple sends here on both the kick drum and the snare drum, and I've sent them to this channel here, which I call the sidechain channel. And what this will basically do was, as we start to set up the rest of the instruments, I want to make sure that we always hear the kick drum and the snare drum, no matter what we do. And so I will put compressors, as you'll see when we do the next channel. I'll put compressors at the end of the effects chain, so that every time the kick and the snare drum are triggered, are played, it will trigger the compressor to close and take down a little bit of the volume, so we can always hear the snare drum and the bass drum. Okay, let's go to our toms, the keystrokes. I'm going to add a little bit of distortion. This is just a distortion plugin. You can use whatever. You can use whatever distortion plugin you like. I'm going to add a little bit of EQ, and we can hear this. And as I told you, just so the toms don't get in the way, so I'm actually going to raise them here, so the toms don't get in the way. I've sidechained this compressor. It will only happen, as you can see, in rhythm with the kick drum and the snare drum. I'm going to turn it back down. Great. Next, let's deal with this water. Now, the one thing with the water, it's kind of a nice sound. It's a little bit annoying, but we can make it better by only highlighting the portions that we like. So I basically have cut off completely all the way up to 2000 hertz around. And I'm going to add a filter, a high-pass filter, to continue to highlight the sort of the upper register of this sound, because this is really what we want. And I want it to kind of gel better. The groove is okay. It has a sort of wonky new hip-hop thing going on, but I'm going to add it to a delay, and then this way the delay will kind of let it rhythmically lock in a little bit better. Let's add the rest of our elements here. We have the crowd. I'm going to turn the EQ on that. And the same thing here. This is actually just a regular compressor. And I'm sending it to another delay. I always use my reverbs and my delays on buses. This way I have more control over them. So let's do the next thing, which is the chimes. And I first ran the chimes through a filter here to give them a little bit more body, a general compressor, and I did a sidechain compressor to make sure it doesn't get in the way of the kick of the snare drum, and EQ'd it. So now let's go to our voice. Our voice has been EQ'd. I don't really need the entire portion of the voice. I've cut out a lot of the bottom end, slapped a compressor on there to keep everything together because it jumps around a lot. And outside of a sidechain compressor, I've also given it its own reverb, so it's not so in front of the mix. And I'm going to put some reverb and delay on the snare drum and the kick drum. And let's bring in the bass. So now we can basically hear everything. And one side note on the bass and the kick drum, the everlasting battle of the low end. Just to show you briefly, on the bass here, I put a sidechain compressor connected to the kick, so now we can hear the kick. And I've also, on the bass, on the bass we have our EQ. And I'm also going to bring up the EQ of the kick drum. Now, in general, what I like to do is I decide who's going to be the lowest instrument. This time I decided it was the bass. So you can see on the kick drum, I was able to cut out the majority of the line so that the low end of the bass actually pops through. And also, right around here at 150 hertz on the kick drum, I have the body of the sound. And I made a slice at around just that frequency inside the kick so that there's room for that portion of the bass to come out. Now time for the unveiling, and let's take off the mono and listen to it in stereo. Sounds much deeper. You can hear everything is kind of in its place. And now what we can do is we can get into a little bit of a quick mastering. Now the first thing I like to do on the mastering is put a very, very light compressor on there. It has a very low ratio of 1 to 1.4. And what this does is it helps glue everything together, and it makes sure that all the elements are there and everything sounds a little bit more together. Afterwards, I decided to use a multipressor, and the reason why I decided to do that, a multipressor or a multi-band compressor basically allows you to split up the compression into frequency bands. So all I want to do is compress the low end, so I've split it up into 2 different sections. And I'm only going to compress from what is 20 to 150 hertz. And this will allow me to let my bass stand out. You can hear the bass now a bit better. So I've compressed it and then I've raised the gain. To add more bite and harmonics to the general sound, I've added exciter. And then slapped on a linear EQ just to make some minor adjustments. And finally, a limiter to raise it up to the volume that can be used for things like Spotify and for SoundCloud, and so that your music sounds competitive in volume to everyone else's. And here we go. And that's our kind of quick mastering. And don't forget, you can use the same samples to create different pattern variations, like this one. Coming up, right here. And then go back. And we've made a beat, mixed it, and mastered it in around 20 minutes. And thank you very much, and hope to see you guys soon.